And there actually are a couple of questions already in the queue. And I think I'm just going to ask this question and let Meg and Sean and Tom let you decide who wants to take it on. So this is from Susan Robinson. What's the source of this need to control bodies? Is it fear of our own impulses, sexuality, loss of control? What? I've always thought that to understand people's behavior, one should follow the money. In other words, economics. What's the source of this need to control bodies?
I'll start, and then Sean, you brought it up. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. I was just thinking about Black Lives of UU had some theological symposiums online that we could all go to and watch that were wonderful. And I remember Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who is a professor now and actually acting president at Starking School for the Ministry, said she wondered if the reason why white church was so disembodied was that if we were embodied, we would have to sit in all of the pain that we have inflicted as white people on the world. And I'd never thought of it quite like that. And I thought it was a very profound point that when you are embodied, you get it all, and some of it is very painful. If I, as a white person, face the history of what my people have done to other people, there's a lot of pain in that. And it takes courage and it takes willingness to not run from that and put it out somewhere else. So that's just a thought that I had. I thought she made a really good point.
I think that's a really true answer for right now. And I think the original source of the control of bodies is colonialism, and controlling bodies is controlling people and resources. And it's harder to just control a mind and let the body be free. The control of the body has been sort of the foundational practice of oppression forever.
The only thing I might add is just to note that it's very much part of patriarchy, that it's usually women's bodies, the bodies of people of color, indigenous peoples, that's, we haven't talked a lot about patriarchy as one of these roots, but that's very much here. It's a good question.
The next question that I'm tracking here is from Rick Lathrop, who asks, actually for Reverend Sean, what culture inside Unitarian Universalism needs to change?
Well, I think we inherited a very upper middle class white culture, sort of where, especially Unitarianism and Universalism a little bit less so, it was a little more diverse. We inherited kind of the dominant culture of the United States. And then again in the 1950s, when there was a more overt rejection of Christianity and embrace of humanism, that somehow got mixed up in, we are rejecting bodies and emotions, and we are all about the mind. We are the people of the big ideas, and we are highly intellectual. I mean, even when they planted fellowships, they planted them in college towns. They didn't, it was like, oh, to be a Unitarian Universalist, or a Unitarian especially, you would need to be in a college town, have access to higher education. That's culture. When you make assumptions about what the norm is and what the values, the good values, the normal things are, that's your culture. And so that's the culture I'm saying. Universalism, especially as a theology, begs us to change. The very foundation of universalism resists this idea that that there's a hierarchy of being, and says, no, you must love and learn to live in covenant with everyone.
Thank you, Sean. The next question that I have is from Osvaldo del Valle. I hope I'm getting that name something close to right. Reverend Riley, as I watched the anti-LGBT videos you showed us during your sermon, I could not help but to connect that hate and violence to that we just experienced on January 6th in our nation's capital. My question is, do you see the connections from then and now? And were you surprised by what happened in our nation's capital?
I wish I had been surprised. That actually, I was only surprised that it took that long. I mean, the far right was being called out from before that presidency. We knew who that base was, and it is the same base. That I hope I was trying to make people. You know, as Suzanne Farr said, sexism, racism, homophobia unite the right and divide the left. And it is the same people. The religious language is being less talked about, but the religious right is still in there, absolutely still in there. Study Mike Pence. He is violently homophobic and transphobic. And misogynistic, and he looks like, you know, a TV dad, but oh my gosh, he is an authoritarian writ large. So it is the same people, and Tom's feeling of foreboding I share. We are in a time where some of the demons that people maybe thought were gone have really been unleashed and authorized, and that's partly why I showed that, actually, because it was so reminiscent to me of the violence with which oppression is, and the physicality with which, particularly, and it was sad. And I've read some stuff about not all of the people who went into the Capitol were straight white men, you know, but the ideology that went into the Capitol was very much about restoring natural order as it has never existed, but people want to create. So did I miss part of that question, Bill?
No, I think you got it. Not that it can be completely answered. The next one is from Dana, and I'm just going to skip the last names for now because I will no doubt mess them up. So I beg your understanding about that. From Dana, Meg, I heard you say that one of the roles you held as a religious professional was to lend credence to the BGL movement when it was accused of being anti-religious. What have you learned from non-religious organizing partners about what the impact of having religious witness is for our movements? Are there other ways that our faith perspective is a resource, spiritual or practical, to secular or mixed movements for justice? Wow. You're muted, Meg.
There we go. I would love to hear Sean and Tom also respond to this, because this, I think, crosses, and Bill, you too, it crosses movements. What I have heard consistently, and it started back then, is that people of faith bring a depth and a seriousness, a soul level to what is often talked about as superficial, but really is about humanity and who deserves to be alive and what are really religious issues. So especially in those days, it was important because immediately the, oh, you're just anti-religious thing would just stop the conversation. So having me there in a clerical collar made that hard to say. I remember when I went on TV against the head of the Promise Keepers, and someone said to me in the green room afterwards, one of the pundits said, I thought you were going to be like, you know, the National Organization for Women, but you came at it completely differently, because I was talking about humanity. And I've seen that in, you know, in various struggles for justice, when the real depth of what we're looking at is expressed clearly, it takes things to a different level. And I would add that I don't know that there's ever been a movement for justice that got there without faith community in it.
right.
So I'll add one thought here. You know, it was Dr. King who said that when the religious community is doing its work, it functions as a headlight rather than a tail light. And part of that functioning as a headlight is to hold up a moral lens, a moral lens that can hold the whole community, a kind of a moral standard. At First Unitarian, our vision statement talks about the church as a moral beacon in the community. And I think that's part of the role of the religious voice in settings that have become have become secular. You know, protests in the civil rights days was religious protest. I mean, that's what it was. You know, but too many faith communities have gotten a bad name in the interim, and so it's less expected. But that's, I think, the role.
A little different angle on it. There's a book called Covering by Kenji Yoshino that talks about the history of how we formulated civil rights law. He's both a gay man and a constitutional lawyer. And he talks about how we did it in a way that we said, if you prove you're close enough to the ideal, then you get civil rights. So you have to prove gay people aren't too queer. You have to prove that Black people are just as capable. You have to always prove that you're good enough to get civil rights. And I think universalism is the theological corrective to that mistake we made about how you prove you deserve civil rights. It should be inherent. Civil rights are something that everyone deserves, and it's a really great read because it helps me turn my thinking and my theology to become more central than my sort of intellectual legal analysis, I guess. And I think that the church helps us do that.
The only thing I would add is just there's a dimension of ministry. Especially in my early years of ministry, would be sad when I would be with other GBLT folks, and I would say that I'm a minister, and I would just see this wall go up like, we don't have anything in common, and the pain that was in that, and if part of what I think part of what ministry is trying to deconstruct some of those walls, because there's a lot of need for ministry and relationship there, and that recognition how we're all doing this together. Yeah.
Thank you all. The next question is from Chris. When the church grew by 40% in 1 year, the LGBT membership dramatically increased from a few to at least 100. Many left in the next few years. What therefore needs to be done at the church level to keep the members who came to Unitarian Universalism?
Shall I take it first? Or Meg, do you? I would note one of the things I remember from that time is there were gay and lesbian folks who were drawn into the church because they were not welcome anywhere else, and actually had a hard time with our liberal theology, that it was an acceptance and you're responsible for discerning what it is your belief system, what your call is. And there was actually for them, that openness did not fit them. And so I remember in my brain thinking, well, they're gay, they should be welcome here. But there's a theological dimension to that, I think. So that's the first thing. I think also practically in those years, a consultant used the metaphor of First Unitarian in Portland in those years of all the growth of that we were a vacuum cleaner without a bag attached, and that we were drawing in all these folks, but we did not have programs and ministries to connect them to each other and to the church. And so it was actually a fairly chaotic time, and we did lose people. We had a revolving door. And I hope I think that is better now. But in those years, very much, we did not, it was hard to hold folks.
Anybody else want to offer a comment on that one? Sean?
I am a serial muter, and so I keep having to ask to be unmuted. I would say that anytime you invite someone into a community and you basically say, here's our community, come be just like us, your welcome is only partial. And people will leave if they feel like the demand in a community is you become like us to really fit or to be able to be invited into leadership. This happens all the time in, when a few folks are invited in. I will say that as a trans minister, even as recently as my last ministry, so 5 years ago, I would hear when trans people came in, are we becoming a trans church? Once we hit the fourth trans person besides me, that's what we hear. And so the welcome is partial. There's still work to do. And I imagine that was true in Portland when you got an influx of folks and they're, it was like, oh, we aren't prepared. We haven't had queer people in leadership. We haven't developed programs. We want you here, but we don't know really who you are and how you would change us. What gift are you bringing to us?
That makes me think of the surveys that show that hundreds of thousands of people, if they have to pick a religion, say that they're Unitarian Universalist, but we don't know who they are. And it says to me that this may be a time we're coming into when people are once again going to be coming into congregations because of the lack of safety. Things ebb and flow. I remember being at a local church here the week after the last, not this most recent presidential election, but the one before that. And it was someone who said, oh, I haven't needed to be here for the last 8 years. I need to be here now. I'll be here for 4 years. And so I think that there are times people's needs shift, but I would hope that some of those people are still connected and that if they want church, they would know where to go. And I think in a way, though I sometimes wish that we could guilt and shame people into coming regularly, in retirement, I am one of those people who doesn't always show up. And I see that life is complex and busy and it is for lots of people. But I think the more real and deep the caring is in a community, the more there's a hub for people to come back to.
See, another Bill asks, how can LGBT information be effectively learned by children, mid-age, and teens?
I would say they are the least likely to need to learn right now, that youth culture is really on it. They have books to read. They have folks that have been out their whole lives that are their friends and companions in life. I actually, I feel like there's a lot of room in youth culture that doesn't exist with older adults, especially around gender, non-binary gender expression. I feel like there's room for that in young youth and young adult culture in a way that I even don't get. I'm now an old trans guy, right? And so my definition of gender was formed in a more binary system. And sometimes I find myself going, what? I don't, huh? How does that work? You're trans, but you were assigned female at birth and you love femme expression, but you still experience yourself as trans. What? For me, because being trans was about not being one thing. It wasn't necessarily about claiming a more complex thing. So I feel like the burden's on us to keep up, and that youth and young adult culture is full of resources. Ask any librarian, you'll find a plethora of good books and resources for queer kids and youth.
I'll chime in that I raised a 24-year-old who was off the binary from day one. And when I look at what is available now for preschool, for every age, I mean, there are there are people doing story hour at my local library now for preschoolers. I mean, about gender. And, we had like 2 books that we just clung to, and other kids Sean's age had none, so I feel like it's really a different world, and I'm amazed by how much easier pronouns are for young people. It's not a struggle. It's just, they're not resisting binaries. They're just not doing it.
I have to tell a brief anecdote. I was taking a walk with the dog a couple days ago, and I met a kid who lives next door, I think 8 or 9 years old. I said, "What are you doing today?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to my friend's house to play games. They're non-binary." And he had clearly, I mean, this was new information. And I started to cry, actually, because when I was 8 or 9 years old, the concept of a non-binary household, I mean, it just like, and that was just a sign of there are beautiful things in our world right now, and to not lose sight of that. So, yeah.
I'll just add a plug for Our Whole Lives, which Unitarian Universalism has been doing for decades. Hopefully we'll get it into the public schools. Scott asks, there is an important role for critique and activism against negative forces. What role is there for celebration and joy in terms of sustaining those who suffer from oppression and breaking down barriers between those who are others to each other? Have you experienced these? What did it feel like mentally, emotionally, and bodily for you? Great question.
It's a wonderful question. One of my so many teachers, but there was a woman named Barbara Major who used to speak at General Assembly, a Black woman from New Orleans. And her motto was, "It ain't going to be easy, so it better be fun." And I feel the same way. It's Emma's revolution. If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of it. I think marginalized people, actually, in my experience, the people of Roxbury were not sitting around moping. They were very joyful people, despite living lives I could not conceive of in terms of homelessness, poverty, drug addict, all kinds of things. They were joyful people, and that church was a joyful theology. That liberation, that resurrection was real. It was not abstract. It was right in the community, and that, I think, is essential to do the work. Without it, we're just going to burn out. The burning bush didn't burn out, and I think that what keeps burning is the joy that, and for me. And I hope I was trying to say this, I wasn't name dropping. I was saying it was these connections that made it so wonderful. And so, just being here with, people whose names I know and seeing some faces of people I love, it makes all the difference in the world, those connections.
Other comments?
I just preached on the 3 parts of our mission statement here at the Ashland Church, which are kind of dated, but they're embrace diversity, empower connection, and engage in the work. And so I just preached on engage in the work. And I really talked about, by framing it as work all the time, are we missing this whole idea that it's fun, it's joyful, it's relationship building. You're going to have new friends. You're going to know them deeply. And I really kind of got stuck on this idea that we need incremental celebrations. That one thing about Unitarian Universalist culture, in my experience, is we're afraid to celebrate the partial victory or the little step. We're waiting for it's kind of related to the exceptionalism in a way. We, when we make a grand gesture, and until we succeed at the grand gesture, we're going to be very serious and work really hard, which is kind of, from our roots in not the Pilgrims, the Puritans. It's kind of puritanical thinking in a weird way, that we have to wait till we're perfected to have any fun. And I really think we need to have incremental celebrations all along the way, for all folks. For folks, when they see the second person that they see themselves reflected in, they get together and have a party. Like, look, here we are. And it's not me alone anymore. And also, and I think that's Blue is doing that within Universalism writ large, and we should take their leadership because it's what's going to keep us going. Meg's right. It keeps us from burning out. But we got to do it all along the way. And we got to believe it's fun.
Amen.
Andy asks, I should say that I've got now 23 questions in the queue. We're going to get to as many of these as we can. We will preserve all of them. Don't think that your question will be discarded. But I just need to confess that it's unlikely we're gonna make it through the whole list. Keep adding. These are great questions. Andy asks, isn't the big question from our church history why Unitarian Universalism has been relatively successful with educated white people and has had no real impact outside the Portland, Berkeley bubble? I didn't know the Portland, Berkeley bubble was a thing.
I didn't
Yeah,
understand.
I don't know either.
Go ahead, Sean.
I sometimes say I think we were relatively successful with G and L people because they were already in our pews. They were already enough like us in that way that we have structured, like I said about even civil rights, like we're able to recognize the humanity of the folks that we consider not too different. And so queerness was already present among us in a way that transgender and racial diversity were not as much among us. And so we perceive them as other much more. And there's a lot more resistance to this day, a lot more fighting about whether they are part of us. It's really sad.
I just want to say another talk I could have given today is about our marriage equality work, which Bill and I did a lot of together. And I would say very clearly that we would not have marriage equality if it were not for Unitarian Universalists in many, many states. If you look at the plaintiffs in those cases, people who gave years of their lives, lay people, there were Unitarian Universalists in every one of them. And I believe that part of why they had the stamina to do that was because they had a faith that supported them through it. It really means a lot to have somebody in the world who you feel like really is supporting you. And while that's a limited thing, it's not everything. Incremental celebration, it's a big deal. And I really do think Unitarian Universalists changed the world in that way. And I'm not saying we did it alone, my God, no, not at all. But I do think every single struggle for that I know of, Unitarian Universalists were in there right in the beginning. And I'll tell you that because I was in DC through that, the gay rights groups weren't for it. I mean, that did not come from the Human Rights Coalition or whatever. Blessedly, I forgot what it even stands for.
I'm going to offer, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Just, I think that, we get a lot of headlines at places like the Portland Church, but I think a lot of witness in a place where it's not popular to be for marriage equality, for LGBTQ rights. I think those little congregations that really, it takes a lot of courage and bravery to bear that witness, and just to, that they may not get as much attention, but it's hugely important ministry.
Two quick comments. One is that in terms of what you were mentioning, Sean, it's what Mark Morrison Reed calls the perversity of diversity. Mm-hmm. That it's easier to welcome folks of a particular identity when they walk in and see folks that look like them and act like them. And there's a truth to that. It is also true, however, and I will speak from instances at First Unitarian in Portland, that we have driven people away. People who have come, trans folks, Black trans folks who have come to choir practice and have been asked whether they really belonged in the church. So it's both the perversity of diversity, and we need to be reflecting on our practices of welcome too. Let's see, the next question is from Ian. Reverend Riley, as someone who has recently woken up to their own whiteness, I realize daily how easy it is to relax back into assuming that identity of mine is the norm. What exercises, resources do you use to work against this dominant culture and remind yourself to think about your own white identity? Another great question.
That's a great question. Primarily for me, it's in relationships. And some of them are with people that are in my family and friendship circle, and some of them are blogs that I read, books that I read, music that I listen to, art that I watch. There is so much that's available to us now to remind us how who we are. That I am very grateful. Social media makes it possible, if people are willing to share what's going on for them, to just be able to witness lives that are very, very different from ours. And so for me, it's relational. And yeah, and I think early on, it was really particular people. I would think about doing something I wanted to do, and then I'd think, how would it be if that person was with me? And would I want to live there? Would I, would I do that? And so it really was particular that way. And now there are enough relationships, I think, that they reinforce. And of course, I've made a million mistakes. People of color have told me about some of them and not told me about some of them. And as I said before, there's been kindness extended to me in times where really I was totally unaware of what I was doing, and it was hurtful. And I think overcoming defensiveness about that, I love that Jay Smooth video that talks about how instead of thinking of racism being our appendix and we get it removed, and then if someone says we're racist, we say, no, I had that removed in 1973. We think of it like dental hygiene. And if someone says you have something in your teeth, you don't say, no, I brushed my teeth yesterday, so I can't. You just assume that they're helping you get something out of your teeth. And so for me, it's been a huge gift to my own humanity and some of it, is reading people like James Baldwin, who wrote before I was born, or, there's just so much that's available when we're willing.
Other responses, or shall we go ahead with the next one? We'll go ahead with the next one. This is from CJ. As we UU struggle with the economic reality and privilege of ordination, what has been the role of lay leaders in supporting and working for social justice within the UUA and within society as a whole?
I mean, I think lay leaders do the majority of the work, especially at the congregational level. And it's always my hope as a minister that what I'm doing is empowering them to find ways to get involved and do the work, and that they will get the joy and the reward of that, that it is, it's not a burden, it's an opportunity for them. So here in Ashland, we just put up the first 3 pallet shelters, they're called, which are heated 8 by 8 foot huts, basically, for folks to live in the winter. And that was all done by lay people. All I did was say, of course, that's a great idea. And they, the work of it and the reward of it, they're celebrating now because we're about to place our first families. We have 3 pallet shelters, and all of them are going to be occupied by single parents that are homeless or unhoused.
So many of our folks in their professional lives, in their home lives, are doing work for justice. They're teachers, they're social workers, they're people who are out there doing things every day. And I think where I would love to see us take our power more is collectively. I think that individually, a lot of folks are members of things, they're engaged, and but Ashley Haran, who is now heading up Side with Love campaign at the UUA, talks about we have all these buildings and leaders, and we have more than almost any other justice community in the world. What if we didn't try to hoard those, and we shared, and we really let ourselves be a movement? And I get so excited by that. I said when I was in Roxbury, I saw what that group could do with, I mean, they were poor, they were really poor, and still they were shaping Boston, which was a big city. And so I think that I think that lay people could claim a whole lot more power. I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia as a UU. We didn't have a minister. It was all lay led. It was a different time, but oh my gosh, that's where I learned to be an activist. Absolutely, in that congregation.
Next question is from Dwayne. Please say more about how the illusion of exceptionalism keeps us from seeing more clearly and acting to bring about universal beloved community. I suspect this is too new, arises from desire to maintain the exceptionalism myth.
I agree. I mean, I think that last point is really, I wrote on my notes, right next to exceptionalism, I wrote humility. And I think the spiritual practice that we need, which is a little different than the question you asked, to counter this feeling that we're so, it's like, well, it's related to perfectionism, which, I talked about when I gave the Berry Street essay. Like, we have to let go of this idea that we can be perfect. And exceptionalism is trying to always say, and it's related to white fragility, we're good enough, we're good enough, we're one of the good ones. And we have to get some humility in the mix that says we have something to learn. And learning is fun and beautiful. It's not painful. So I don't know, that's just a mishmash of thoughts about exceptionalism and how we counter it and what it looks like, how it works within our movement.
I'll take this moment. I've wanted to do this about 5 times now, just to mention, in case anybody hasn't heard about the Commission on Institutional Change and the really amazing resource that they created for Unitarian Universalist congregations to look at transforming culture. And it's called Widening the Circle. You can get it on the UUA website. It's a great, boards are reading it. It's just a huge gift to the movement. So for exceptionalism and all the other parts of our culture we want to transform. I just didn't want to let this go by without mentioning it.
So Gilda asks, as you say, we are so white, cis, male, middle, upper, educated, upper class as a group. Our church services are set in pattern, never changing. Although content changes, the form does not. Can changing our services lead us to more body-centering, heart-centering connection? Music is a tool. How can we use that more strongly to lead intention in these areas?
Go on, Sean, talk about Cabaret Church.
Well, I feel like I've talked a lot. So if there's someone else who wants to go first, please do. What I was actually going to say is I've been so excited to be doing online worship at Roof. The way we're doing it is pre-recorded YouTube services, not live Zoom services. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, and the joy in it for me, is that I have this wide array of leaders and music and folks that I can get in front of a relatively old white congregation in Ashland, Oregon in a new way. And yes, music is moving them, and spoken word and all sorts of things that I don't have the resources in Ashland necessarily. I can get Shakespeare, I can get classical music, but a world within Unitarian Universalism has been open to me to get folks I can have a whole service of leadership of people of color for them. And they don't even really notice it. That they just say, wow, that was a great service. And it's getting a lot more heart and joy into it. Cabaret Church is another idea I had a decade ago now and only got to do once, but really mixing in the arts with our worship practices in brand new ways. Cabaret in Weimar, Germany was resistance. It continued, they held cabarets in concentration camps to keep their spirits up. So that there's a way for me that integrating the arts of all kinds into our worship is for me a key to unlocking a new way of being together on Sunday mornings or beyond Sunday mornings. And I hope my sermons are getting shorter and shorter and leaving more and more room for everybody else to celebrate, sing, and be together.
I would, I think that there's a balance. I think in our congregation, the music in particular is one of the ways that that varieties of ways of the Spirit are expressed. I think that there's also I learned early in my ministry from a minister named Carl Scoville, who was for many years the minister of King's Chapel in Boston, which is as traditional as you're going to get. And he talked about how there's a structure, having a structure in a liturgy offers a kind of safety that you can relax into that expected pattern, that expected liturgy, and that he articulated it as you almost experience a kind of regression in terms of it's a safe space, so you can hear things that maybe you otherwise wouldn't hear. That helps me understand when I preach a sermon, and in the days when we were live, people would come through and say, wow, when you said da da da, and I'm knowing that I didn't say that, but people heard what they needed to hear, and there's a safety in that I think is important in not changing the form so much that we lose that, like there's a what's going to happen next. So I think there's some sweet spot of balance here that we're all probably in our particular congregations trying to achieve.
Let's see. Cindy says, I'd like more comments from folks on what we take from today's conversation to our work on the 8th principle and anti-racism.
Well, I have the pleasure of meeting weekly with Paula Cole-Jones, who's been doing that work for a while. She is working with something that the board has launched called the Article 2 Commission, which is looking at Article 2 of the UU bylaws, which perhaps you didn't know, I didn't, that the principles and purposes are part of our bylaws, which I think is kind of weird, but there they are, and there we are. But Paula shares the stories of radical transformation that come out of the congregations that get involved with that work. And I think at its most profound, it's not about thinking about, as a white person, other people, it's about really thinking about who we are, who we're called to be, what church is. It's really, really deep work. And I'm excited by the conversations that those congregations are having with each other. And I think all of that work, the UU board has really been focusing on disability justice, which is a very exciting intersectional. There's a lot of really good theory that really shapes what it is to be human. I mean, it's just, when you get into that work at the level that I think we need to work it, it's about, sure, it's about a ramp, that's fine, but that's not what it's about. It's about who are we? Who are we to each other? What are we on this earth to do? And so I think at its most, the anti-oppression work of all kinds takes us there and deepens faith. It's not like you have spirituality and then you have this work. It's like, no, we are in bodies. Every one of us is in bodies. So our spirits and our bodies are not separate entities. I wrote a column some years ago about how I wanted to start not All Souls Church, but All Bodies Church, because what it is to really understand the connection of our human bodies, which of course is our human souls, I think is where that work goes, and hopefully leads into understanding that in our wider communities, there is work we can do, there's influence we can have, there are things that we can do to actually change some of the, you know, the horrors that communities are living with.
Other comments? Let's try for one more. I've been scanning through the chat, and blessedly, you all have been answering your own questions, which I think is exactly, doesn't get any better than that. Here's one from Troy. My question is, where have you found the greatest roadblocks or stumbling blocks in your work? Where do you feel that your energy is best placed to make the largest tangible change? Where do you find your work most satisfying?
Tom, you want to start for a change?
Yeah, I think it's in seeing people's openness to grow and the wanting. I think I stumble over myself all the time, and my good intentions. And I think I'm constantly inspired by people in the congregation. It's that striving and that never and that's there. That I think that's really what the spirit. That's an important part of what the spiritual life is our striving. And then part of what the community brings us together is to give us a kind of launching pad for that, and knowing that we're not doing that work alone.
Ron?
I feel like all this talk about exceptionalism is me naming the biggest roadblock that I feel like we bump into, is the sense that we're either already good at it, or it's not our work to do, or that it's intellectual work only and not that deep work that Meg was describing, and Tom. I think a lot of our people are still afraid. A lot of folks who are what I call religious refugees, they were, deeply and profoundly hurt in the religious home of their youth, really fear naming this as deeply spiritual, religious, moral, whichever word you use, but the work of being an ethical human being, it's still scary. I just this week got an email from someone about that sermon about engaging in the work. Well, how do I know that the committees are engaging in the work? So she positioned herself as the supervisor of the committees to see that they are engaging in the work, rather than understanding that it is her work to engage. And she would, if she joined a committee perhaps, or she, how do I know social justice is doing what they're supposed to? Well, is social justice being done? And if you want to know more, join the committee and help. So that idea that we position ourselves sometimes as managers, making sure that other people are doing their job right, is a part of that for me in the actual congregation. That we don't claim it. We see the burning bush and we say, hey, somebody put that out, instead of saying, what is it calling for me to do?
Meg, I think you get the last word.
Yeah, so those are two really good questions. For me, the deepest joy is living the transformation, myself and around me. I didn't know, and the personality that I have makes it really almost inconceivable to me that I just retired from 38 years as a religious professional in Unitarian Universalism. That is not something I set out to do, but everything I did led to something else that was interesting, and I feel incredible gratitude to be part of this world where I know amazing people who are doing incredible things and challenge and inspire me. And it's because of that great prize I came forward, as Bill said, to serve as co-moderator. It's because I think I've been given so much, I want to give back. I think the obstacle, you could call it lots of things. I'll call it fear. The characteristics of white supremacy culture that have been named perfectionism and exceptionalism, and we're not going to do anything if it's not everything. And that kind of when people think that there's some place to be besides in the big mess of it, and that they can, and I used to think it, so I understand, like that there's some place to be that's separate from the big mess if you're just intellectual enough, or you just, push it away. And I find that exhausting because it makes me lonely. I'm in the mess of it. Come on, come and just dance in the mess of it with me. Let's be together in this thing. Well, sure, we'll make mistakes, but let's love each other and let's be here. So yeah, I think it's that that fear is what I'd name it. And but the joy is all the people who do say, okay, and seeing this new generation of, well, multiple new generations of ministers that have come along after me who are doing things. And I go, wow, I just never could have thought of that in a million years. It's so fun to watch and to be part of that bigger pattern.
And for me, I think it's much what you're saying, Meg, is come dance with me in the middle of the mess. Because we're all in the mess. There's no getting out of the mess. The mess is all around us, and the worst news is that it's inside us too. And somehow that's the best news, because it allows a kind of building of community which doesn't require us to be perfect, where we can actually be human. I want to thank everyone who has been a part of these couple of hours. I want to take a moment to thank Gia and Carrie Heinz, who have been doing the magic of the tech behind the scenes. Sean and Tom, you have added so much to this conversation today. I'll be eternally grateful to you. What a gift you have made. And finally, to Meg Riley, my good and old friend, what a blessing. Thank you all, and take good care. Stay safe and well.